Now, I just said that in English, the word and functions as a propositional connective. But it doesn't always function that way, even in English. For instance, think about a sentence that uses the word and, like the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. I can think of at least three different interpretations of that sentence, three different things that that sentence could mean. And corresponding to those three different things that the sentence could mean, three different ways that the word and is getting used in that sentence. So here's one thing the sentence could mean. Jack and Jill could be a name of a particular entity, like let's say a fast food company. There could be a fast food company called Jack and Jill. And maybe Jack and Jill, the fast food company, makes some kind of special stew. And lawyers have been asking Jack and Jill to disclose the ingredients of this special stew because they find that a lot of the customers who eat this stew have been getting sick recently. So lawyers are asking Jack and Jill to disclose the ingredients, and Jack and Jill refuses to do so until finally the spokesperson for Jack and Jill holds a press conference in which she discloses the ingredients of the special stew. Okay, now I might describe that situation by saying Jack and Jill finally talked. But what I mean there is that there's a particular entity, namely the company, Jack and Jill, and that company finally talked through its spokesperson, finally disclosed the ingredients of its special stew through its spokesperson. Now, on that interpretation of the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked, the word and is not being used as a propositional connective. It's not connecting two propositions and forming a larger proposition out of those two smaller propositions. Here's another way of understanding the sentence Jack and Jill finally talked. Let's suppose Jack, Jill, and Roger are having a silence contest to see who among the three of them can be silent the longest. And all three of them are silent for a long period of time, and you're calling in, while I'm watching the silence contest, you're calling in to me periodically to find out if any one of these three contestants finally talked. And finally, at one point, you call in and you say, okay, has anyone talked yet? And I say, well, Jack and Jill finally talked. So Roger won the competition. Now there in that sentence, when I say Jack and Jill finally talked, the word and is being used as a propositional connective. What I'm saying, in effect, is that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. So there are two propositions that I'm trying to communicate. The proposition Jack finally talked and the proposition Jill finally talked. And I'm using the word and to connect those two propositions into a larger proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked. And so Roger won the competition. There, the word and is being used as a propositional connective. It's just connecting the proposition Jack finally talked and the proposition Jill finally talked to form a larger proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked. Now there's a third way that the word and could get used, just in that sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. Suppose Jack and Jill are a couple, and recently they've been having a tough time. They've been angry and resentful, and they haven't been talking to each other about the sources of their anger and resentment. Well, suppose they decide that they're going to finally get their grievances out into the open. They're going to talk to each other. Then I might say, Jack and Jill finally talked. Now there, when I use the word and, I'm not just connecting the proposition Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. What I'm trying to communicate is not just that each of them talked. I'm trying to communicate that each of them talked to the other. I'm trying to say that they talked to each other. So there, in that third interpretation, the word and is not working just as a propositional connective. It's not just connecting the proposition that Jack finally talked and the proposition Jill finally talked, because I'm trying to get across something more than just that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. I'm also trying to get across the point that they talk to each other. Right? That's what I'm trying to communicate there with the sentence Jack and Jill finally talked. So there, the word and is not being used as a propositional connective. So I hope I've made it clear that the word and can get used in a bunch of different ways in English. One of the ways it can get used is as a propositional connective, to connect up two propositions into a larger proposition. But that's not the only way it can get used. It can get used in other ways as well, and I've tried to give examples of those just now. What we're going to be concerned about here is just the use of and as a propositional connective. And then we'll look at other expressions in English, like or, not, but, only, if, and so forth, that also get used as propositional connectives. We'll look at those and see how those work. Okay, so now let's consider the propositional connective and. Notice, though, that even when the word and is being used as a propositional connective, it can still get used in different ways. For instance, suppose I say, I took a shower and got dressed. Well, there, and is being used as a propositional connective. It's connecting two propositions, the proposition I took a shower and the proposition I got dressed. It's connecting those into a larger proposition, I took a shower and got dressed. But there, the word and is being used to convey a sense of temporal ordering, a sense of time. The idea is, when I say I took a shower and got dressed, the idea is I first took a shower and then got dressed. Right? It wouldn't mean the same thing if I said I got dressed and took a shower. But sometimes, when the word and is being used as a propositional connective, there's no suggestion of temporal ordering. So, for instance, if I say I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them, there's no suggestion that I'm doing one first and then the other. Right? I'm just doing both. I'm holding them and looking through them. There's no suggestion that one is happening before the other. Now, in that second usage, when the word and doesn't convey any kind of temporal ordering, where it just combines two propositions into a larger proposition without conveying any sense of temporal ordering, then I'll say the word and is not just functioning as a propositional connective, but it's functioning as what I'll call a truth functional connective. So what's a truth functional connective? A truth functional connective is a propositional connective that creates new propositions whose truth or falsity depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the propositions that went into creating them. Let me give you some examples to illustrate that definition. So consider, again, our example, Jack and Jill finally talked, where that's used to mean just that Jack finally talked and that Jill finally talked. Okay, so when is that proposition going to be true? When is it going to be true that Jack and Jill finally talked? Well, that's going to be true whenever it's true that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. As long as those two conditions are true, as long as Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked, it's also going to be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. So if it's not true that Jack finally talked, then it won't be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. If it's not true that Jill finally talked, then it won't be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. But as long as it is true that Jack finally talked and that Jill finally talked, it will be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. So that use of and is a use of and as a truth functional connective, because it creates a new proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked, the truth or falsity of which depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the two propositions that it connects. There are lots of other examples. So for instance, consider the use of and as a truth functional connective in the proposition, I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them. Again, when is that proposition going to be true? It's going to be true only in these cases where it's true that I'm holding my binoculars, and it's also true that I'm looking through my binoculars. If both of those are true, then the whole proposition, I'm holding my binoculars and looking through them, will also be true. If either one of those initial propositions is false, if it's false that I'm holding the binoculars, or if it's false that I'm looking through the binoculars, then the whole proposition, I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them, will also be false. So there again, the truth or falsity of the whole proposition depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the propositions that go into creating it, using the truth functional connective and. And that's what shows that and in that usage is a truth functional connective. It's that the proposition that it creates by joining other propositions is a proposition whose truth or falsity depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the ingredient propositions that went into creating it. That's a truth functional connective. Now, in week 4, this week on propositional logic, we're going to be studying truth functional connectives and how the use of truth functional connectives in argument can make those arguments valid no matter what those arguments are about. Now, let's move to some examples.